famous atheist, now believes in God. One of the world's leading atheists now believes in God, more or less, based on scientific evidence. This was the headline of a December 9, 2004, Associated Press story that went on to say, a British philosophy professor who has been a leading champion of atheism for more than a half-century has changed his mind. He now believes in God more or less based on scientific evidence, and says so on a video released Thursday. Almost immediately, the announcement became a media event, touching off reports and commentaries around the globe, on radio and TV, in newspapers, and on internet sites. The story gained such momentum that AP put out 2 subsequent releases relating to the original announcement. The subject of the story, and of much subsequent speculation, was Professor Antony Flew, author of over 30 professional philosophical works that helped set the agenda for atheism for half a century. In fact, his Theology and Falsification, a paper first presented at a 1950 meeting of the Oxford University Socratic Club, chaired by C.S. Lewis, became the VVI Preface most widely reprinted philosophical publication of the last century. Now, for the first time, he gives an account of the arguments and evidence that led him to change his mind. This book, in a sense, represents the rest of the story. I played a small part in the AP story because I had helped organize the symposium and resulting video in which Tony Flew announced what he later humorously referred to as his conversion. In fact, from 1985, I had helped organize several conferences at which he had made the case for atheism. So this work is personally the culmination of a journey begun 2 decades ago. Curiously, the response to the AP story from Flew's fellow atheists verged on hysteria. One atheist website tasked a correspondent with giving monthly updates on Flew's falling away from the true faith. Inane insults and juvenile caricatures were common in the free-thinking blogosphere. The same people who complained about the Inquisition and witches being burned at the stake were now enjoying a little heresy, hunting of their own. The advocates of tolerance were not themselves very tolerant. And apparently, religious zealots don't have a monopoly on dogmatism, incivility, fanaticism, and paranoia. But raging mobs cannot rewrite history. And Flew's position in the history of atheism transcends anything that today's atheists have on offer. Flew's significance in the history of atheism. It is not too much to say that within the last 100 years, no mainstream philosopher has developed the kind of systematic, comprehensive, original, and influential exposition of atheism that is to be found in Antony Flew's FEFTY years of anti-theological writings. Prior to Flew, the major apologists for atheism were those of Enlightenment thinkers like David Hume and the 19th century German philosophers Arthur Schopenhauer, Ludwig Feuerbach, and Friedrich Nietzsche. But what about Bertrand Russell, who maintained rather implausibly that he was technically an agnostic, although he was an atheist in practice? Sir Alfred Ayer, Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and Martin Heidegger, all of whom were 20th century atheists well before Flew began writing. In Russell's case, it is quite obvious that he did not produce anything beyond a few polemical pamphlets on his skeptical views and his disdain for organized religion. His Religion and Science and Why I Am Not a Christian were simply anthologies of articles. He produced no systematic philosophy of religion. At best, he drew attention to the problem of evil and sought to refute traditional arguments for God's existence without generating any new arguments of his own. Ayer, Sartre, Camus, and Heidegger have this in common. Their focus was on generating a specific way of engaging in philosophical discussion, an after effect of which was the denial of God. They had their own systems of thought of which atheism was a byproduct. You had to buy into their systems to buy into their atheism. The same might be said of later nihilists like Richard Rorty and Jacques Derrida. Of course, there were major philosophers of Flew's generation who were atheists. W.V.O. Quine and Gilbert Ryle are obvious instances, but none took the step of developing book-length arguments to support their personal beliefs. Why so? In many instances, professional philosophers in those days were disinclined to dirty their delicate hands by indulging in such popular, even vulgar, discussions. In other cases, the motive was prudence. Certainly, in later years, there were atheist philosophers who critically examined and rejected the traditional arguments for God's existence. These range from Paul Edwards, Wallace Matson, Kai Nielsen, and Paul Kurtz to J.L. Mackie, Richard Gale, and Michael Martin. But their works did not change the agenda and framework of Discus Scion the way Flew's innovative publications did. Where does the originality of Flew's atheism lie? In Theology and Falsification, God and Philosophy, and the Presumption of Atheism, he developed novel arguments against theism that, in some respects, laid out a roadmap for subsequent philosophy of religion. In Theology and Falsification, he raised the question of how religious statements can make meaningful claims. His much-quoted expression, "death by 1,000 qualifications," Cations, captures this point memorably. In God and Philosophy, he argued that no discussion on God's existence can begin until the coherence of the concept of an omnipresent, omniscient spirit had been established. In the Presumption of Atheism, he contended that the burden of proof rests with theism, and that atheism should be the default position. Along the way, he of course analyzed the traditional arguments for God's existence. But it was his reinvention of the frames of reference that changed the whole nature of the discussion. In the context of all of the above, Flew's recent rejection of atheism was clearly a historic event. But it is little known that, even in his atheist days, Flew had, in a sense, opened the door to a new and revitalized theism. Flew, Logical Positivism, and the Rebirth of Rational Theism. Here's the paradox. By defending the legitimacy of discussing theological claims and challenging philosophers of religion to elucidate their assertions, Flew facilitated the rebirth of rational theism in analytic philosophy after the dark day of logical positivism. A little background information will be of value here. Logical positivism, as some might remember, was the philosophy introduced by a European group called the Vienna Circle in the early 1920s, and popularized by A.J. Ayer in the English-speaking world with his 1936 work, Language, Truth and Logic. According to the logical positivists, the only meaningful statements were those capable of being verified through sense experience or true simply by virtue of their form and the meaning of the words used. Thus, a statement was meaningful if its truth or falsehood could be verified by empirical observation, e.g., scientify see study. The statements of logic and pure mathematics were tautologies, that is, they were true by definition and were simply ways of using symbols that did not express any truth about the world. There was nothing else that could be known or coherently discussed. At the heart of logical positivism was the verification principle, the claim that the meaning of a proposition consists in its verification. The result was that the only meaningful statements were those used in science, logic, or mathematics. Statements in metaphysics, religion, aesthetics, and ethics were literally meaningless because they could not be verified by empirical methods. They were neither valid nor invalid. Ayer said that it was just as absurd to be an atheist as to be a theist, since the statement, God exists, simply has no meaning. Today, many introductory works of philosophy associate Flew's approach in theology and falsification, with Ayer's kind of logical positivist assault on religion, since both question the meaningfulness of religious statements. The problem with this picture is that it does not in any way reflect Flew's own understanding of the matter then or now. In fact, far from buttressing the positivist view of religion, Flew considered his paper as a final nail in the coffin of that particular way of doing philosophy. In a 1990 presentation I organized on the 40th anniversary of the publication of Theology and Falsification, Flew stated, as an undergraduate, I had become increasingly frustrated and exasperated by philosophical debates which seemed always to revert to, and never to move forward from, the logical positivism most brilliantly expounded in language, truth, and logic. The intention in both these papers, the versions of Theology and Falsification, first presented at the Socratic Club and then published in university, was the same. Instead of an arrogant announcement that everything which any believer might choose to say is to be ruled out of consideration a priori, as allegedly constituting a violation of the supposedly sacrosanct verification principle, here curiously maintained as a secular revelation, I preferred to offer a more restrained challenge. Let the believers speak for themselves, individually and severally. The story is taken up in the present work, where Flew comments again on the provenance of his celebrated paper. During my last term at the University of Oxford, the publication of A.J. Ayer's book Language, Truth and Logic had persuaded many members of the Socratic Club that the Ayerian heresy of logical positivism, the contention that all religious propositions are without cognitive significance, had to be refuted. The first and only paper I ever read to the Socratic Club, Theology and Falsification, provided what I then considered to be a sufficient refutation. I believed I had achieved a total victory, and there was no room for further debate. As any history of philosophy will show, logical positivism did indeed come to grief by the 1950s because of its internal inconsistencies. In fact, Sir Alfred Ayer himself, in a contribution to an anthology I edited, stated, "Logical positivism died a long time ago. I don't think much of Language, Truth and Logic is true. I think it is full of mistakes. I think it was an important book in its time because it had a kind of cathartic effect. But when you get down to detail, I think it's full of mistakes which I spent the last 50 years correcting, or trying to correct." At any rate, the departure of logical positivism and Flew's new rules of engagement gave a fresh impetus to philosophical theism. Numerous major works of theism in the analytic tradition have since been written by. Second, they show no awareness of the fallacies and muddles that led to the rise and fall of logical positivism. Those who ignore the mistakes of history will have to repeat them at some point. Third, they seem entirely unaware of the massive corpus of works in analytic philosophy of religion, or the sophisticated new arguments generated within philosophical theism. It would be fair to say that the new atheism is nothing less than a regression to the logical positivist philosophy that was renounced by even its most ardent proponents. In fact, the new atheists, it might be said, do not even rise to logical positivism. The positivists were never so naive as to suggest that God could be a scientific hypothesis. They declared the concept of God to be meaningless precisely because it was not a scientific hypothesis. Dawkins, on the other hand, holds that the presence or absence of a creative superintelligence is unequivocally a scientific question. This is the kind of comment of which we say it is not even wrong. In Appendix A, I seek to show that our immediate experience of rationality, life, consciousness, thought, and the self militate against every form of atheism, including the newest. But two things must be said here about certain comments by Dawkins that are directly relevant to the present book. After writing that Bertrand Russell was an exaggeratedly fair-minded atheist, over-eager to be disillusioned if logic seemed to require it, he adds in a footnote, "We might be seeing something similar today in the over-publicized tergiversation of the philosopher Antony Flew, who announced in his old age that he had been converted to belief in some sort of deity, triggering a frenzy of eager repetition all around the internet." On the other hand, Russell was a great philosopher. Russell won the Nobel Prize. The puerile petulance of the contrast with the great philosopher Russell and the contemptible reference to Flew's old age are par for the course in Dawkins's epistles to the enlightened. But what is interesting here is Dawkins's choice of words, one by which he unwittingly reveals the way his mind works. Tergiversation means apostasy. So Flew's principal sin was that of apostatizing from the faith of the fathers. Dawkins himself has elsewhere confessed that his atheistic view of the universe is based on faith. When asked by the Edge Foundation, "What do you believe is true even though you cannot prove it?" Dawkins replied, "I believe that all life, all intelligence, all creativity and all design anywhere in the universe is the direct or indirect product of Darwinian natural selection. It follows that design comes late in the universe, after a period of Darwinian evolution. Design cannot precede evolution and therefore cannot underlie the universe." At bottom, then, Dawkins' rejection of an ultimate intelligence is a matter of belief without proof. And like many whose beliefs are based on blind faith, he cannot tolerate dissent or defection. With regard to Dawkins's approach to the rationality underlying the universe, the physicist John Barrow observed in a discussion, "You have a problem with these ideas, Richard, because you're not really a scientist. You're a biologist." Julia Vitullo Martin notes that for Barrow biology is little more than a branch of natural history. Biologists, says Barrow, have a limited intuitive understanding of complexity. They're stuck with an inherited conflict from the 19th century and are only interested in outcomes, in what wins out over others. But outcomes tell you almost nothing about the laws that govern the universe. Dawkins's intellectual father seems to be Bertrand Russell. He talks about how he was inspired, at the age of about 16, by Russell's 1925 essay, What I Believe. Russell was a determined opponent of organized religion, and this makes him a role model for Harris and Dawkins. Stylistically, too, they emulate Russell's penchant for sarcasm, caricature, flippancy, and exaggeration. But Russell's rejection of God was not motivated just by intellectual factors. In My Father, Bertrand Russell, his daughter, Catherine Tate, writes that Russell was not open to any serious discussion of God's existence. I could not. Tate, nevertheless, believes that Russell's whole life was a search for God. Somewhere at the back of my father's mind, at the bottom of his heart, in the depths of his soul, there was an empty space that had once been filled by God, and he never found anything else to put in it. He had the ghost-like feeling of not belonging, of having no home in this world. In a poignant passage, Russell once said, "Nothing can penetrate the loneliness of the human heart except the highest intensity of the sort of love the religious teachers have preached." You would be hard put to find any passage that remotely resembles this in Dawkins. Returning to the account of Flew's tergiversation, it has perhaps never occurred to Dawkins that philosophers, whether great or less well-known, young or old, change their minds based on the evidence. He might be disappointed that they are over-eager to be disillusioned if logic seemed to require it, but then again they are guided by logic, not by fear of tergiversation. Russell, in particular, was so fond of tergiversation that another celebrated British philosopher, C.D. Broad, once said, "As we all know, Mr. Russell produces a different system of philosophy every few years. There have been other instances of philosophers changing their mind on the basis of evidence. We have already observed that Ayer disavowed the positivism of his youth." Another example of one who underwent such radical change is J.N. Findlay, who argued in Flew's 1955 book, New Essays in Philosophical Theology, that God's existence can be disproved, but then reversed himself in his 1970 work, Ascent to the Absolute. In the latter and subsequent books, Findlay argues that mind, reason, intelligence, and will culminate in God, the self-existent, to whom is owed worship and unconditional self-dedication. Dawkins's old age argument, if it can be called that, is a strange variation of the ad hominem fallacy that has no place in civilized discourse. True thinkers evaluate arguments and weigh the evidence without regard to the proponent's race, sex, or age. Another persistent theme in Dawkins's book, and in those of some of the other new atheists, is the claim that no scientist worth his or her salt believes in God. Dawkins, for instance, explains away Einstein's statements about God as metaphorical references to nature. Einstein himself, he says, is at best an atheist, like Dawkins, and at worst a pantheist. But this bit of Einsteinian exegesis is patently dishonest. Dawkins references only quotes that show Einstein's distaste for organized and revelational religion. He deliberately leaves out not just Einstein's comments about his belief in a superior mind and a superior reasoning power at work in the laws of nature, but also Einstein's specific denial that he is either a pantheist or an atheist. This deliberate distortion is rectified in this book. More recently, when asked on a visit to Jerusalem if he believed in the existence of God, the famous theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking is reported to have replied that he did believe in the existence of God, but that this divine force established the laws of nature and physics, and after that does not enter to control the world. Of course, many other great scientists of modern times, such as Heisenberg and Planck, believed in a divine mind on rational grounds, but this too is whitewashed out of Dawkins' account of scientific history. Dawkins, in fact, belongs to the same peculiar club of popular science writers as Carl Sagan and Isaac Asimov from a previous generation. These popularizers saw themselves not simply as scribes, but as high priests. Like Dawkins, they took on themselves the task not just of educating the public on the findings of science, but also of deciding what it is permissible for the scientific faithful to believe on matters metaphysical. But let us be clear here. Many of the greatest scientists saw a direct connection between their scientific work and their affirmation of a superior mind, the mind of God. Explain it how you will, but this is a plain fact that the popularizers with their own agendas cannot be allowed to hide. About positivism, Einstein in fact said, "I am not a positivist." Positivism states that what cannot be observed does not exist. This conception is scientifically indefensible, for it is impossible to make valid affirmations of what people can or cannot observe. One would have to say, only what we observe exists, which is obviously false. If they want to discourage belief in God, the popularizers must furnish arguments in support of their own atheistic views. Today's atheist evangelists hardly even try to argue their case in this regard. Instead, they train their guns on well-known abuses in the history of the major world religions. But the excesses and atrocities of organized religion have no bearing whatsoever on the existence of God, just as the threat of nuclear proliferation has no bearing on the question of whether E equals mc. So does God exist? What about the arguments of atheists old and new? And what bearing does modern science have on the matter? By a striking coincidence, at this particular moment in intellectual history, when the old positivism is back in vogue, the same thinker who helped end its reign a half-century ago returns to the battlefield of ideas to answer these very questions,